More than 1,000 years ago, in the frozen lands of Scandinavia, a remarkable civilization began to rise. The Vikings came from Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, surrounded by enormous mountains, deep forests, and cold northern seas. Life in this harsh environment was not easy. Viking families farmed the land, raised animals, fished the ocean, and built The greatest weapon of the Vikings was not the sword. It was the ship. Their famous longships were fast, narrow, and remarkably advanced for their time. They could travel across open oceans, but they could also move through shallow rivers. This gave Viking warriors an extraordinary advantage. They could appear suddenly on distant shores, attack quickly, and disappear before their enemies could respond. With their ships, the Vikings transformed the sea into a highway. And soon, European kingdoms would learn to fear the sight of those sails on the horizon. In the late 8th century, Viking raids began to shock Europe. One of the most famous early attacks occurred at Lindisfarne, an isolated monastery in northern England. The arrival of the Vikings was sudden and terrifying. Their ships reached the coast quickly, and their warriors moved with incredible speed. Monasteries and coastal settlements became targets. But the Vikings were more than simple raiders.
But there was another side to the Viking world. They were also traders. Viking merchants traveled along the rivers of Europe, reaching distant markets and powerful cities. They traded furs, amber, iron, weapons, silver, and other valuable goods. Their journeys connected Scandinavia with the rest of Europe, and even lands far to the east. Viking ships carried not only warriors, but also merchants, families, and explorers. The same people who could raid a kingdom could also build a trading settlement. The Viking world was far more complex than the legends suggest.
Then, the Vikings pushed even farther west. They explored the North Atlantic, reaching Iceland and Greenland. These journeys were incredibly dangerous. There were no modern maps, engines, or navigation systems. Viking sailors depended on the stars, the sun, the wind, and their knowledge of the ocean. They faced freezing temperatures, enormous waves, and long periods without seeing land. Yet, they continued. Eventually, Viking explorers reached a land across the Atlantic that was completely unknown to most Europeans. That land was North America.
The Viking Age also produced legendary figures whose stories survived for centuries. Among them was Ragnar Lothbrok, a legendary warrior and king remembered in Norse sagas. There were also powerful women, including legendary shield maidens who became symbols of courage and strength. Viking leaders could unite hundreds or even thousands of warriors behind them. Their ambitions were enormous. Some wanted wealth, some wanted land, others wanted fame that would survive after their deaths. And their stories became legends that people still tell today.
As Viking power grew, their influence spread across Europe. They fought against kingdoms, established settlements, and controlled important trade routes. In England, Scandinavian armies captured large territories. In other regions, Vikings traveled along rivers toward Eastern Europe and Constantinople. Some became rulers. Others became merchants.
Some settled permanently in the lands they once attacked. Over time, Viking culture became part of the societies they encountered. The raiders from the north were slowly becoming kings, farmers, traders, and settlers. But their greatest journey was still ahead. As Viking power grew, their influence spread across Europe. They fought against kingdoms, established settlements, and controlled important trade routes. In England, Scandinavian armies captured large territories. In other regions, Vikings traveled along rivers toward Eastern Europe and Constantinople. Some became rulers. Others became merchants. Some settled permanently in the lands they once attacked. Over time, Viking culture became part of the societies they encountered. The raiders from the north were slowly becoming kings, farmers, traders, and settlers. But their greatest journey was still ahead. The Vikings left behind more than stories of war. They created settlements, trade routes, and connections across enormous distances. They crossed the Atlantic long before Columbus. They influenced the history of England, Ireland, France, and Scandinavia. Their ships became symbols of exploration. Their warriors became legends. And their mythology continues to inspire books, films, and stories around the world. But perhaps the greatest Viking legacy was their courage to enter the unknown. They looked beyond the horizon and asked a simple question. What is waiting on the other side? More than 1,000 years later, we are still fascinated by the answer. They were Viking. But there was much more to Viking society than ships and battles. Behind every warrior stood a community that depended on farmers, craftsmen, traders, and families. Viking life was often difficult, but their society was highly organized. Farmers worked the land during the short northern summers, growing crops and raising animals. Blacksmiths created the weapons and tools that Viking communities depended on. Woodworkers built houses, boats, and everyday objects. And women played an important role in Viking society. They managed farms and households while men were away on long voyages.